Look around you. In Nigeria, you may hear English before you hear many of the languages spoken by your own ancestors. Across Africa, millions of people communicate in English, French, or Portuguese every single day. But have you ever stopped to ask, how did this happen? Africa is home to thousands of languages: Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Amharic, Swahili, Wolof, Zulu, Somali, and countless others. Yet European languages became official languages across much of the continent. You probably use one of these languages without thinking about it. You may speak it at school, read it online, use it at work, or communicate with someone from another part of your country. But the story behind that language is much older than your generation. Before English became the language of government in Nigeria, before French became dominant in countries such as Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, before Portuguese became an official language in countries such as Angola and Mozambique, Africa already had complex systems of communication, trade, scholarship, and diplomacy. So how did the languages of a few European countries become languages spoken by hundreds of millions of Africans? Was it simply because Europeans arrived, or was something much bigger happening? To understand the answer, we have to go back. Long before English, French, or Portuguese became official languages in many African countries, Africa was already home to an extraordinary number of languages. From the Sahel to the forests, from the mountains of Ethiopia to the shores of the Indian Ocean, people had their own languages, traditions, and ways of communicating. Language wasn't simply a way to speak. It carried history. It carried stories. It carried names, songs, beliefs, traditions, and knowledge passed from one generation to another. To lose a language could mean losing part of a people's memory. But Africa's languages did not exist in complete isolation. Traders traveled, travelers crossed borders, markets brought different communities together, and people developed ways to communicate across linguistic boundaries. In some regions, certain languages became widely used for trade and communication between different communities. Hausa became an important lingua franca across much of West Africa. Swahili played a similar role across large parts of East Africa. These languages connected people who did not necessarily share the same ethnic background. Language was also connected to education and scholarship. In places such as Timbuktu, scholars produced and preserved manuscripts covering subjects ranging from law and theology to mathematics and medicine. Knowledge was being written, taught, debated, and passed on long before European colonial governments arrived. And here's something important. The political map of Africa did not always determine the boundaries of language and culture. Communities traded, migrated, married, and interacted across territories ruled by different kingdoms. Identity was often more complicated than a line on a map. But during the age of European exploration, something new began happening along Africa's coast. European ships began arriving in increasing numbers. At first, these encounters were largely about trade, but over time, trade would become something much more powerful. New merchants brought new goods, new religions, new political interests, and eventually new languages. But nobody yet knew how profoundly these encounters would change the continent. European contact with Africa was not new. For centuries, North Africa had been connected to Europe through the Mediterranean. But from the 15th century onward, Portuguese sailors began exploring farther down the Atlantic coast of Africa. What began with voyages and trade would eventually become something much larger. European merchants were interested in African gold, ivory, spices, and other valuable goods. African rulers and merchants also had their own interests. They negotiated, they traded, and they decided what they were willing to exchange. These early relationships were not simply Europeans giving orders to Africans. Over time, however, the relationship became increasingly unequal. European powers developed stronger naval forces, expanding commercial networks, and eventually colonial ambitions. Alongside trade came missionaries, military power, and the desire to control territory. Then came one of the darkest chapters in his history. The transatlantic slave trade expanded into a massive system involving European merchants, African intermediaries, American plantations, and enormous human suffering. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Communities were devastated, families were separated, and the effects lasted for generations. Language traveled with these expanding networks of religion, commerce, and political power. Portuguese spread along parts of the African coast. Later, English and French would spread much farther as Britain and France expanded their colonial territories. But the biggest transformation was still ahead. By the 19th century, European ambitions had changed dramatically. The goal was no longer simply to trade with African societies. European governments increasingly sought direct political and economic control. And this was happening at a time when European industry was demanding more resources and new markets. Britain wanted influence. France wanted influence. Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and others pursued their own ambitions. European powers increasingly competed with one another for territory across Africa. This competition became known as the Scramble for Africa. And this is where language becomes important. Once European governments began controlling territory, they needed ways to govern it. They needed administrators, courts, schools, official documents, and systems of communication. European languages increasingly became languages of power. Conquering territory was one thing, governing it was another. European colonial governments needed a system that could operate across enormous territories. They needed people who could read official documents, work in government offices, interpret laws, and communicate with colonial administrators. Language became part of that system. Then came one of the most powerful institutions of all, the school. Missionaries and colonial governments established schools across different parts of Africa. Education could open doors to new opportunities, but in many colonial systems, European languages became closely associated with formal education. Imagine being a young person in that system. Your home language is the language of your family and community, but the language used in school may be English, French, or Portuguese. The language used in official documents may be the same. The language used by government may be the same. Suddenly, knowing that language could mean access to opportunities. The same pattern appeared in the courts. Laws and official proceedings increasingly operated through colonial languages. If you wanted to navigate the colonial administration, you often needed to understand the language of that administration. As colonial cities expanded, language became even more important. Traders, workers, civil servants, soldiers, teachers, and business owners from different communities increasingly needed ways to communicate. European languages could become a bridge between people who spoke completely different African languages. But something important happened. European languages did not simply replace African languages. People continued speaking their own languages at home, in their communities, in markets, and among friends. Instead, many Africans became and something else happened. Africans reshaped the languages they encountered. Words, expressions, pronunciation, grammar, and ways of speaking were influenced by local languages and cultures. The result was not simply European language transplanted onto African soil. New African varieties emerged. Take Nigeria, for example. English became the country's official language during the colonial period and remains so after independence. But Nigerian English is not simply British English spoken with a different accent. Nigerian languages, culture, humor, expressions, and experiences have all influenced the way English is used here. And this created a fascinating paradox. A language introduced through colonial history could eventually become a tool used by Africans to communicate with one another, to write books, create music, build businesses, tell their own stories, and challenge the very systems that introduced it. Then independence arrived. Across Africa, colonial flags came down. New nations were born, but their leaders faced a difficult question. What language should the new nation speak? Across Africa, independence movements grew stronger. One country after another began breaking away from European colonial rule. New flags were raised, new governments were formed, and millions of people dreamed of building nations on their own terms. But independence created a difficult question. What language should these new nations use? Imagine a country with dozens or even hundreds of languages. Which one should become the official language? If one language is chosen, what happens to everyone who speaks another? And if several languages are made official, how does the government manage education, courts, documents, and national administration across all of them? Nigeria is a powerful example. The country is home to hundreds of languages and many major ethnic groups: Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Kanuri, Tiv, Ijaw, Ibibio, Edo, Fulfulde, and many others are spoken across the country. Choosing one indigenous language as the national language could have created fears of political or cultural dominance. English offered another possibility: a language that belonged to none of Nigeria's major ethnic groups. For countries with enormous linguistic diversity, a colonial language could sometimes function as a neutral bridge. Someone from Kano could communicate with someone from Enugu. Someone from Ibadan could work with someone from Calabar. They didn't necessarily share the same mother tongue, but they could use English to communicate. But there was another side to the story. When a foreign language dominates government and education, indigenous languages can receive less attention. Children may become highly fluent in English, while becoming less confident in the language spoken by their grandparents. And this is why the story isn't just history, it is happening around us today. A child can speak one language at home, another language at school, and perhaps a mixture of several languages with friends. Africa's linguistic identity is constantly evolving. But here's the part that's often forgotten. Africans didn't simply receive these languages unchanged. They adapted them. They mixed them with indigenous languages. They created new expressions, new accents, new forms of literature, music, comedy, and storytelling. The languages changed because the people who spoke them changed them. So today, something remarkable has happened. A language that arrived through colonial history can now be used to tell distinctly African stories. African authors write in English. African musicians perform in it. African filmmakers use it. And millions of Africans have made these languages part of their own identity. Think about an ordinary day. You wake up, you check your phone, you go to school or work, you read messages, you watch videos, you fill out forms. You may even speak to people from different parts of your country. And for millions of Africans, a European language is part of almost every one of these activities. Language can open doors. It can help someone enter university apply for a job, start a business, communicate internationally, or reach an audience far beyond their hometown. That is one reason European languages remain so valuable in many African countries. But there is another question. If English, French, and Portuguese help connect Africa to the world, what happens to the languages that connect Africans to their own heritage? The language your grandmother speaks, the language of your traditional songs, the language of stories that were never written down. Perhaps the answer isn't choosing one language and abandoning another. Perhaps Africa's strength is its ability to speak many. A child can speak an indigenous language at home, English at school, Pidgin with friends, and another language with people from a different region. Multilingualism doesn't have to be a weakness, it can be a strength. And technology is changing the story again. Social media, smartphones, digital publishing, music, film, and artificial intelligence are making it easier than ever to create and share content in African languages. Languages that once struggled for space in formal institutions can now reach millions of people online. So the question is no longer simply, why does Africa speak European languages? The more important question may be, what will Africans do with all the languages they have inherited? Will indigenous languages disappear? Will they grow stronger? Will technology help preserve them? Or will a new generation create something entirely different? So why does Africa speak English, French, and Portuguese? Because history created systems of power around those languages. Colonial governments used them, schools taught them, courts and administrations adopted them, independent governments often retained them, and generations of Africans adapted them and made them their own. But perhaps the greatest lesson isn't about English, or French, or Portuguese. It's about power, because history shows us that when powerful institutions choose a language, that language can shape education, opportunity, government, and even identity. But language also belongs to the people who speak it. Nigerians have transformed English. Ghanaians have transformed English. Kenyans have transformed English. Africans across the continent have adapted European languages to express African experiences. And at the same time, African languages continue to carry histories that no foreign language can completely replace. So the next time you speak English, or French, or Portuguese, remember that you're speaking more than just words. You're carrying history, and perhaps the future of Africa's languages will not be about choosing between the old and the new, but learning how to preserve both, because a language can tell us where we came from. But what we say with it can help determine where we're going.